everyone, I am Kimberly, the 5-Minute NP. The 5-Minute NP was born out of my belief that small, incremental changes can drastically change the trajectory of your life. Our genes do not have to determine our lifespan. My goal through this podcast is to act as a roadmap that bridges the gap between knowledge and action, leading to you living your healthiest, happiest, longest life. Welcome to the 5-Minute NP podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the 5-Minute NP podcast. I hope everyone is doing well. In many of my posts on social media, I have often said, without our brains, we are useless. Well, Dr. Austin Perlmutter joined me on this episode to share just how powerful our brains really are. He even said we literally have a new brain every 3 or 4 days. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, with his dad, Dr. David Perlmutter, wrote the book Brainwash, which he discusses today. Dr. Austin Perlmutter is a board-certified internal medicine physician who focuses on the effects of burnout, stress, and depression, as well as preventative care and chronic disease management. He aims to help people get unstuck in life. In the interview, he discusses why so many people feel stuck in life and disconnection syndrome, the significance of BDNF and neuroplasticity, our 3 brains, and much more. Such an informative interview with helpful takeaways we can begin implementing into our life right away. Enjoy the discussion and thank you for being here. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. My goal is truly to help you live your healthiest, happiest, longest life with making small, incremental daily changes with real big impact. Welcome to the 5-Minute NP podcast. Hi, Dr. Perlmutter. Welcome.
Hey, Kimberly. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Looking forward to this conversation today. And I thought we would just start out with learning a little bit more about you, your practice, what you've been up to.
Yeah, where do I start? So my background is I'm an internal medicine doctor. I'm a board-certified internal medicine doctor. And I got into medicine for a variety of reasons, I guess. But the main one was that I believed that the tools we had available would be sufficient to be able to treat, reverse, basically make a big difference in diseases for a wide variety of diseases. And I went into internal medicine because I recognized that the top contributors to both death and disability in the modern day are these chronic and largely preventable diseases. Diabetes, heart disease, certain types of cancers, stroke, even things like Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that was a big breakthrough for me was the understanding that all of the conventional tools available in modern medicine do a good job of slowing decline, do a good job of managing symptoms, don't do a good job of getting to root causes of what is driving and creating diseases in the first place. So I did kind of an about course after I finished my training, and I had the opportunity to spend several years researching and writing a book, which I then co-published with my dad, David Perlmutter, called Brainwash. And the basis for this was the understanding that if we look at all of these diseases that I've just described, again, the top contributors to death and disability around the world, that they stem from our patterns of decision-making. They stem from the way that we interact with our environment. And while many people don't have the opportunities to, let's say, make healthy decisions around food and exercise, many people do. And despite that, we're still not making healthy choices. And this isn't a blame situation. This isn't telling people you need to exercise more, eat healthier food. It's more of trying to understand, how does the brain make choices in the first place? What is it that leads us to deciding we need to eat fast food versus going home and spending the time to make a healthy meal, growing vegetables in our garden versus spending that time on social media? And what we found in this book, in our research for this book, was, I think, pretty revealing. It's that in the modern day, the deck is stacked against us. We are, in essence, being set up for unhealthy lives. The reason for that is because we are having our brains built to make unhealthy decisions, to become stuck in patterns of unhealthy thinking. So that then brings up a whole kind of suite of questions and understandings. But the main learning from this is that we can take back control over our brain function. And when we do that, we can take back control over our health. So that was again, kind of a big breakthrough. It really changed the way that I approach health. And the book came out in 2020. And kind of at the same time, and one of the main themes that we were looking at in this book, and something I've focused on significantly since then, is specifically brain patterns related to depression. It's something that personally has been kind of an important understanding for me based on my life experience, something I've seen both in myself and my colleagues. And it's, I think, an area that has been historically kind of put as a weakness or a self-blame issue when people have mood issues. And then even beyond that, the scientific understanding that I was educated on, and I think that is largely still understood by the general public, is that depression is just a neurotransmitter issue. It's a lack of serotonin. It's a lack of a neurotransmitter, again, that we can augment by medications. So with a combination of my desire to better understand the brain and the combination of my desire to better understand depression, I've spent the last couple of years researching, writing about what is happening in the brain that leads to depression. What can we maybe then do to help prevent depression and treat depression, specifically looking at non-pharmaceutical interventions. And so I published a paper last year, a review paper, looking at how the immune system is involved in depression, how things like diet and exercise and interpersonal relationships can either contribute to poor mood or can potentially be leveraged to improve mood. And it's really just trying to take a more holistic approach to what is happening in the brain for mental health conditions and specifically depression. So that's the basic recap of where I've been in the last few years. I've been very lucky to get to speak to a number of people, including you, on these subjects and getting to lecture internationally on these subjects. But the goal to all of it is hopefully just to empower people to know there's more going on than maybe what they've heard. And there's more that they can be kind of doing in a typical day that doesn't require outsourcing your health to physicians. Not that they're not essential, but I think if we wait for doctors to improve our health for us, we've missed the boat. And there's so much we can be doing each day to take control over that for ourselves.
Excellent. I read the book. I thought it was great. And you're right. You go into way more detail and it's very clear, informative, and so helpful. And you go into all of these things, the gut microbiome. I mean, just so many things that we don't realize really influence our mood, depression, anxiety, all of those things that in the book you describe a disconnection syndrome. And I do feel like that is more prevalent in today's society with social media. And a lot of statistics are giving in the book, which is excellent. That really brings home these things we're talking about and how it starts early in adolescence, even in the college years, how it affects our health. And so I just thought I would love to talk a little bit more about how our view of depression has changed throughout the years and what we've kind of shifted to or learn more about those underlying causes of depression, more than just what you've kind of mentioned, those targeted increasing those molecules such as serotonin in the blood, in the brain. So how has depression changed throughout the years?
Yeah. Well, I guess let's start a little ways back. So back in the day, meaning thousands of years ago, depression, mood issues, health issues in general were kind of seen as the gods getting back at us for something we had done. That was a starting point. When I did my research into understanding depression, that was some of the earliest work that had been published. And this is, from ancient texts. If you have a bad mood, it's you've done something wrong and you're being punished. And then it transitioned more towards the idea of kind of these humors. This is idea of kind of humor issues. So like that you have these fluids within you that can become imbalanced. And then really where modern depression understanding starts is kind of the 20th century, with the appreciation that molecules in the brain were involved with depression. And this stemmed from the understanding that certain drugs, which were developed for completely different purposes, so these were kind of antihistamines and anti-tuberculosis drugs, had an effect on our mood. And they found that people who were taking these drugs, so these were drugs now that we would call tricyclic antidepressants or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, were influencing mood. And so then from that came the understanding that these molecules like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, which are called monoamines, that's kind of the technical term, seem to play a role in depression. And that has been the prevailing hypothesis for what is driving depression for the last 50 years. One way, shape, or form, there's been some change as far as whether it's serotonin versus norepinephrine. But still today, the main idea is that depression is caused by issues with this serotonin system. And so in the last couple of decades, so again, only pretty recently, we've seen the advent of these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, right? And so these are drugs that are very commonly prescribed. They're the first line therapy for many people trying to manage depression. They're the most commonly prescribed antidepressants, I think, around the world, certainly in the United States. And the concept there is when you think about what's happening in the brain, you basically have a presynaptic neuron, which for people who are just listening, I'm putting my hand up in the air, but it shoots out signals to a postsynaptic neuron, which is, let's say, the hand below that. And there's basically a space between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron is releasing serotonin. Some of that binds to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And again, very oversimplified here, but the idea is you're not getting enough of that signal picked up by the postsynaptic neuron. So these drugs, like these SSRIs, in essence, bind to the presynaptic neuron, and they tell it, don't keep taking out that serotonin, don't keep reabsorbing it from that space. Mm-hmm. So it leaves more serotonin in there to bind to the postsynaptic neuron. And I know we're getting a bit technical here, but the bottom line to this is these drugs are thought to act by increasing available serotonin and therefore improve mood. And there's kind of a number of variants on this theme, or variations on this theme. So you have SNRIs, which act on norepinephrine as well. You have tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, and those act on a number of different pathways. You have monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which keep your neurons from breaking down serotonin. But again, most conventional antidepressants all act on this idea that you're trying to make more of these molecules like serotonin available in the brain. So they have been successful in helping people manage depression. I have certainly prescribed these medications. I've certainly seen many people improve dramatically with these medications. But the challenge here is that the drugs don't work for everyone. And depending on the statistic you look at, it's probably something like a third of people who don't really see a benefit after being treated with these drugs. Additionally, there are very high rates of side effects. So especially GI and sexual side effects might affect between a third and 50% of people. And then you have withdrawal effects. So meaning if you stop these drugs, many people get significant withdrawal effects, around 50% of people. And the thing that I find really interesting is if you were to consider that this was just a serotonin issue, then you would expect a drug that increases serotonin would improve mood pretty dramatically, pretty quickly, hours, let's say. That's kind of the timeline in which serotonin increases in the brain. But the drugs can take weeks to kick in, potentially over a month. Mm-hmm. So with all of that kind of combined, it leads to some pretty glaring issues with this being a unifying hypothesis of what is driving depression in the brain. Mm-hmm. What's really cool and where I'm most involved is that a number of researchers have looked at other pathways in the brain that might be involved. And so just briefly, those include the immune system, the idea that inflammation in the brain may lead to depression, the HPA axis, or HPA is kind of the stress axis, the idea that alterations in the HPA axis may lead to depression. And then one that I'm really involved in understanding right now is what's called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the idea that your brain is constantly rewiring itself, that every moment, every day, you are changing out the strength of and number of connections between your neurons. And researchers have shown that there may be issues with neuroplasticity in the brain. Kind of the first time that was proposed was 2012 in a paper that was published in Science, which is a very top tier journal. And again, it proposed that neuroplasticity, that the wiring of our neurons may be altered in depression, and that may be leading to issues with mood regulation. So just to kind of bring this a little bit to a close here, Why this is so exciting is because if there's more pathways involved in the brain than just serotonin, then there are more things that we can do each day that may help us to improve mood and potentially even to treat depression. So, for example, exercise increases BDNF, a molecule that promotes neuroplasticity. And there have been a number of recent papers, most notably one I think is called the Hunt study, that looked at exercise as an antidepressant intervention, and showing that it's a powerful antidepressant intervention, and that may actually help to prevent depression. Similarly, when you look at dietary strategies, for the most part, we're not talking about diet as a way to treat mental health conditions. But what has been seen kind of overall is that a more Mediterranean style pattern of eating may have a protective effect on depression. And there have actually been several randomized controlled trials where they have taken people with depression and had them eat a more Mediterranean style diet and have seen that these people had improvements in their depression. And the Mediterranean diet is one that has been also linked to decreasing inflammation. So again, try to put all this together. When you know more about what might be happening, there's a lot more you can do to both hopefully prevent as well as manage conditions like depression. And I think it's an empowering thing for people to understand that it's not as straightforward as what they might have heard. And because of that, there's more opportunity to act on these systems.
Yeah, you covered a lot. I was going to be asking you about BDNF and neuroplasticity. And I wanted to know, you've learned a lot about ways we can increase neuroplasticity and the BDNF. What are we doing as a whole to decrease neuroplasticity and BDNF? There's so much you talked about, but what are we doing? Can we decrease this? And do these things decrease as we age?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so one thing that does seem to be clear is that we lose some of these neuroplastic and neurogenesis mechanisms. And so the kind of correlate to neuroplasticity is we can also grow new neurons. And it's been shown that adults can grow new neurons even into older age, which is super cool because, there was this understanding for a long time. You kind of get the number of neurons you're born with, and then you prune some off because you're not using them, and then you just lose them over the course of your lifespan. But the idea that we can grow new neurons is very powerful. It means you can literally grow new brain cells. However, these processes seem to kind of drop off in older age. And so the brain isn't quite as plastic, it seems like, as we get older, meaning it's harder to make some of these changes. It's harder to perhaps grow newer brain cells. From what I have seen, I think that the two principal drivers of decreased neuroplasticity and decreased BDNF would be stress and inflammation. And so there's kind of different mechanisms for this that are technical and involve signaling pathways in the cell. But what does seem to be the case is that higher levels of inflammation, higher levels of chronic stress, and I want to be clear here, chronic stress seems to be the big one, appear to kind of damage our neurons in a number of different ways. One of the things that we talk about in the book is that it's important to think about kind of regions in the brain. And it's not as straightforward as saying this region of the brain controls this thing 100%. But there are certain parts of the brain that seem to be very involved in certain processes. And two of those areas that we really focus on in the brain are what are called the prefrontal cortex, which is, in essence, the part of the brain right behind the forehead that is probably the most implicated in higher level thinking, or it is. It's the part of the brain that seems most responsible for letting you make well thought out decisions, for weighing the pros and cons, for looking or before you leap, right? So for being a thoughtful human. And then the other part of the brain is part of the limbic system, which is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is a part of the brain that is involved with fear. It's involved with emotional regulation. And what has seemed to be the case from the research we've looked at is that you need to have a good communication pattern between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. You need them to talk to each other. And if they aren't talking to each other, there's link to worse decision-making. And there's especially a link to more kind of impulsive thinking. So what you can see is in certain conditions, depression being one, but also anxiety and PTSD, there seems to be more of a breakdown in the connection between these two parts of the brain. And What's interesting, coming back to the stress correlate, is that stress appears to break down the connection between these parts of the brain. So what you have here is basically a neuroplastic effect, because you're changing connectivity, which is a reflection of connections between neurons. And that's seemingly not a good thing. Mm-hmm. But what does seem to be a good thing is that there are a number of interventions that we may be able to take on board. For example, even meditation. So sending people to meditation for several days seems to help to interconnect those regions of the brain, to improve connectivity between those regions of the brain. And then for inflammation, what researchers have shown is that higher levels of inflammation kind of correlate with large-scale brain atrophy. So one of the better examples, and one my dad talks about a lot, is that inflammation seems to predict higher risk for developing Alzheimer's, dementia, and having just general atrophy of the brain. But the last thing I'll say here, which we found when researching for this book, which is, I think, absolutely fascinating, is that generally we talk about inflammation as something that's going to have an effect in the months, years to come. So higher levels of inflammation may later on lead to a condition like, let's say, Alzheimer's. Higher levels of inflammation may later on lead to problems with joint pain or whatever. Mm-hmm. But what researchers have shown is that inflammation appears to influence our thinking and our brains in real time. So inducing inflammation in a person seemingly causes them to feel more depressed. So that is a brain function that has been changed by inflammation. That when you induce inflammation in people, it seems to make them be more impulsive in their decision making. So this is so important, because what we're talking about is the immune system in real time changing the way that we see the world. So that means the food that we eat in a given day, which changes our immune function, the exercise we give ourselves that changes our immune function, the sleep we give ourselves that changes our immune function, that these are all ways that we can, in real time, influence our brain function, hopefully for the better, but often for the worse.
Yeah, actually, I was going to talk with you about that. I was hoping you would go into what you talk about, the three brains and how it relates. And it's crazy, this inflammation that's causing these things. And you discuss further on inflammation, depression, and our gut, and how does that even correlate? Like our gut, you talk about serotonin, depression, and I think it's important to realize, many people don't realize how much serotonin really comes from our gut rather than our brain.
Right. Yeah. So the gut-brain connection is incredible. And if you look at the research that has been published on this specific topic, it has exploded in just the last few years. And fundamental to this is the understanding that the gut and the brain are speaking to each other all day, every day, even while we're sleeping. Mm-hmm. Why does that matter? It's because your gut is sending messages to your brain that is telling your brain, here's what's going on in the outside world. I think for a long time, we've kind of expected that the way our brains know what's happening is based on our senses, our neurons, right? So you see something, you hear something, you feel something, that tells your brain, here's what's happening around you. But what has been very clear from the research is that the information that comes in through our gut has a big role on our entire body, including changing the way that our brains function. So that means the food we eat changes the way that we think. And the way that this information gets from the gut to the brain seems to be two ways. One is through the bloodstream. And so there are a number of different molecules that are produced in the gut that then get into the bloodstream, speak to the brain. And the other one, which is incredible, is that the gut communicates with the brain through the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve, and it runs from the brain down to the gut. It has a ton of different branches. And something that was very amazing when I learned was that the majority of the nerve fibers actually go from the gut to the brain, not the other way around. So the gut is sending a ton of information up to the brain. And that means, again, the food we eat, the immune system in the gut, all of these signals are actually getting picked up by this nerve and run up to the brain and say, here's what's going on down there. And then the brain can actually respond to this by sending signals down on the other branch of the vagus nerve, because it goes up and then it comes down and backwards and forwards. So this is really incredible stuff. And as it relates to mood specifically, you did mention the serotonin. I think it's important to know that, yes, the majority of our serotonin is made in the gut, but that it's not the same serotonin that's involved with mood. And the reason for this is that serotonin can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So you could have a ton of serotonin in your bloodstream. Doesn't mean you're going to have much in your brain. However, the molecule that turns into serotonin, which is called tryptophan, that's that same molecule you've heard about from turkey that's supposed to make you sleepy.
Right.
That one does get pulled into the brain. So when you eat tryptophan, when you eat foods with tryptophan, that has been shown to then influence serotonin within the brain. And there's some data for people with depression that eating more serotonin or tryptophan rich foods may be helpful for mood. What I would just want people to appreciate here, though, is when you're eating food, you're not just pulling in building blocks for your cells. You're not just providing energy for your body. You are pulling in data that is going to influence every aspect of who you are, that is going to change your brain. So in a very real way, the quality of your meals is a vote for the quality of your brain function, the quality of your mood. And I don't want to intimidate people here too much, but if you consider the standard diet, the standard American diet or the Western pattern diet that most people are eating, I would say that is sending the wrong signals to the brain. That is telling the brain to set itself up in a way that allows for worse decision-making, that promotes worse mood, and that could even influence the quality of our relationships. So it is a big deal what we eat.
Absolutely. Other than, I found the tryptophan interesting. And in the book, you actually provide a list of different tryptophan foods and the importance of that. What are some other things we can be eating as far as that goes to boost our mood that way?
So I start with the most basic rules possible, and then you can get more nuanced. And I do think for people who are kind of entering the realm of nutritional interventions, it's helpful to find a practitioner that can help you with this, because there's a lot of not so great information on the web. And there are a lot of people who are selling diets who their first goal is to sell the diet, not to improve your health. Turns out to be the case that the majority of diets work for weight loss, and then the majority of diets then later on don't work because people gain it right back. If you look at what happened to contestants of The Biggest Loser, the majority of them gained all that weight back. Mm-hmm. So the idea that a good diet is one that leads you to lose a lot of weight on the front end is kind of poorly founded, even though that's the most popular way that diets are presented in the modern world. Mm-hmm. So the steps that I kind of take are starting with some core, I call them rules, but they're certainly not hard and fast. But first is to try to avoid the things that people have messed with the most. And that means looking at the foods that you're eating and asking, is this something that you could find in a relatively natural state? And so, for example, if you pick up a fish to eat, like a wild salmon, that's just a wild salmon, right? That's all it is. It's a salmon. That's very different from purchasing a processed meat where there have been a ton of nitrates and other additives included in that. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you're talking about eating, let's say, a grain. Now, many people are opposed to grains, and there's some nuance to that. But if you were to eat, I don't know, a bowl of quinoa, you're eating a bowl of quinoa versus if you're eating a potato chip, you could say in theory, that is, that's a vegetable as well. But the reality is that that's been highly processed in a number of different ways. It's had oils added, often sugar added, additional sodium added. So they're very different as far as what they do for the body. So the things that people have messed with the least, last thing I'll just say there is you can break it down to all of your different macronutrients. So you talk about fats, huge difference between naturally occurring fats that you might find in, let's say, that wild salmon, as far as omega-3s, versus the fats that you're going to find in a feedlot raised cow, which tend not to be as healthy. If you're looking at carbohydrates, huge difference in eating a piece of white bread where you've in essence stripped out the majority of the nutrients and they try to kind of add some back, but most of the nutrients have been taken away both by the breeding of the wheat and by the way that that wheat is processed to make that nice fluffy white bread. Very different from eating something just like even something like brown rice, which isn't probably the overall healthiest thing, but is very different from eating something like a white bread. Mm-hmm. And then moving on, just to kind of include this, so you have fats, carbohydrates, and protein sources, I think are the same thing. I think if you were to look at the quality of the proteins that you're getting in something that you could find in the wild, or even if it's farmed, I mean, that's fine, but does it have all these additional additives to it? So has it been treated with hormones? Has it been treated with antibiotics? Mm-hmm. Just generally trying to find nutrients that humans have messed with the least. But more specific to mood, I wrote a blog article on my dad's website recently, which is in essence a review of where the literature stands on dietary interventions for depression. The clearest pattern that has emerged is a Mediterranean pattern diet is probably the most helpful for depression based on what we know right now. And that is largely an anti-inflammatory diet in that it is one that prioritizes non-processed foods versus the standard ultra-processed foods that most people are consuming in a Western pattern diet. Mm-hmm. So the Mediterranean diet is one that is high in things like nuts and olive oil and unrefined or whole grains, as well as a lot of fish. And this is pretty different from what most people are eating. But turns out that, again, this is one of the most substantiated diets overall for a variety of different conditions like cardiovascular disease. But it also turns out to be the one that is most linked to mood improvement, specifically in depression.
It makes sense when you talk about inflammation and depression and neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, all of that. When you think about the food that we're eating, the processed food, the high fat foods, all that stuff is contributing to that inflammation that then is causing all of those underlying processes and killing our mood on top of it. It makes total sense when you think about all of the effects that it's having on those chemicals and the gut and the brain and all of that. And I think that's what's important for people to understand is that diet you're talking about will also decrease your high blood pressure, which will decrease your risk for dementia and other brain disorders. How do you feel about fasting? I mean, there's a lot of information on fasting and the brain and the ketones. What do you feel like is in the role of fasting for brain health?
Yeah, well, fasting right now is very popular. And anytime something becomes popular in the diet space, I think there's some bias introduced and it's probably being oversold. So whether that's keto or paleo or whatever other diet you're going to hear about, if you're hearing about it if you're reading about a diet in a tabloid magazine in the checkout counter, chances are it's being oversold. However, there is still some really interesting data around fasting. And I think there's a number of ways you can slice it. So one of these is any sort of a diet that a person is engaging in necessitates that they're paying attention to their food. And I think paying attention to their food in the modern day is a great plan. Mm-hmm. So if you decide to go paleo or keto or vegan or to start fasting, you're going to be looking at the food that you're eating. And that's already a huge benefit compared to mindless eating. The other thing about fasting is, so there are a number of different forms of fasting. I guess I should say that right off the bat. Some people do intermittent fasting. Some people do, forms of intermittent fasting like time restricted eating. Some people will do multiple days a week or will even fast for longer than that. I think, first of all, it's probably important that if you're trying anything longer or if you have any blood sugar issues that you consult with a practitioner because it can be a bit of a tax on the system. Second of all, at the moment, I'm a much bigger fan of kind of the time restricted eating approach for most people because from a physiological level or from a physiological perspective, it makes sense to me that we should give the body a break from trying to digest nutrients all day, every day. And so what time restricted eating is, in essence, is basically just kind of compressing your eating or all the food and calories that you eat into a smaller window. So you're not just grazing all day long and then into the night. Instead, you say you're going to eat from, let's say, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., no calories before that, no calories after. So that would be kind of a 12-12 strategy, 12 hours with calories, 12 hours without. And I have seen some interesting work. There was a recent study that came out that was looking at calorie restriction versus time-restricted eating, and it showed that both groups lost weight. But calorie restriction, which is kind of the prototypical dietary approach, which is eat less, is just not fun. No one, I don't know many people who are just saying, you know what, something I enjoy is just trying to eat less food every day, versus the time-restricted eating, which in my experience has been really pretty straightforward. You just don't eat during certain hours, and you can eat what you want during the hours you are eating. And what also is really cool about this is our kind of appetite, our hunger signals are linked to certain hormones that are produced by our stomach, by our GI tract. One of those is called ghrelin, and another one is called leptin. And so leptin can make us feel more satiated, less hungry, while ghrelin can make us feel more hungry. And it's pretty straightforward. If you inject people with ghrelin, they will be more hungry, they will eat more food. But what happens in our bodies is, as we start to adapt to different eating patterns, in this case, time-restricted eating, you're just not going to feel as hungry first thing in the morning. And many of us may have experienced what happens when we are, let's say, getting up really early for a plane flight, or when we're going through a time change and we're in another country, and all of a sudden we start getting hungry at very random times. Our bodies adapt to this. And so what you're doing with time-restricted eating is just kind of teaching your body that we're not eating, at 10 at night. We're not going to do that. And when you don't do that, you find yourself not craving that food at that time. So as it relates to the research around the benefits here, a lot of the fasting research and fasting mimics have been around animal models showing some benefits to longevity, inflammation, a number of metabolic processes. There's now some data coming out about the benefits in humans. There are a number of researchers doing this work. One is Walter Longo down at UCLA. And I think there's definitely some interesting work that is being done. I think when it comes to the fasting piece, if it's something that works for an individual, that's phenomenal, but I just wouldn't go there as a kind of blanket recommendation for all people. While I do think the time restricted eating is something that most people can try and would probably benefit from, maybe at the very least level, because they're just not putting in more junk later in the day and they're paying attention to the food that they're eating. Last thing I'll just touch on here is there's a tether between fasting and ketones or ketosis. And so generally speaking, the idea of a ketogenic diet is that it's one that produces ketones in the bloodstream at higher levels. It produces what's called ketosis, which is a state where you have more ketones, which are kind of these molecules that can be produced by fat breakdown in the body. And that ketones can be used as an alternate source of fuel for a number of tissues, maybe most notably the brain. And that ketones may be in some ways a cleaner source of fuel than glucose, which I think we could probably say is the brain's preferred fuel source, but it will run on ketones if necessary. And when I look at the benefits of diet strategies, one of which is fasting, but mostly like ketogenic diet, which is one that is high in fat and protein, low in carbohydrates, because when you have carbs in your system, you can't really produce ketones. The benefits there seem to be most notable for me in certain conditions. And those would be conditions that are characterized by issues with metabolic state, specifically glucose regulation. So there's been some great work done on these types of diets for conditions like diabetes. So there, I think there's an indication to explore it further. There's some recent research coming out too about ketogenic diet and ketosis for Alzheimer's patients. One of the things that has been described in Alzheimer's is that the brain tends to have changes in the way it can process glucose, with the idea that it's not as good at processing glucose, that it might be resistant to the effects of insulin. And so there's recent data that's come out showing that a ketogenic style diet may be beneficial in Alzheimer's disease. But when it comes to a recommendation for the average person, I tend not to go there. Mm-hmm. I would say that there is research showing that 88% of American adults are metabolically unhealthy. So now we start to get to the point where most people are in some sort of a disease state, and maybe then a disease intervention like a ketogenic diet makes sense. But to come back to my initial point, if you're reading about a diet on a newsstand, the benefits are going to be overblown. And I highly recommend for people who are looking to adopt a new dietary strategy that you find a person with some expertise, rather than listening to what an influencer might say has cured their conditions. Because the goal isn't to do a diet, fix a problem in a week or two. It's to find a lifestyle change for which the food that we eat is really important.
Wow, 88% is a huge percent of people with disease. That's huge. I thought we could tie in just a little bit, go into sleep a little bit, because also Great. When you're talking about ghrelin and leptin, and there's so much involved with just sleep that plays into that, and even the time restricted feeding and glucose control, all of those things. So maybe you could talk about how sleep ultimately affects all that, but not only that, how we cope with stress and mood and our health overall.
Yeah. I tell people that my number one recommendation when they're trying to get their brain in a better spot is to pay attention to their sleep. And the reason for that is that most of the things that make sense to improve our health are not necessarily fun things. They're challenging things. So exercise, if a person doesn't exercise and I tell them you need to get up, move for 30 minutes, 5 days a week, that doesn't necessarily sound either new or exciting. Right. Similarly, if I tell somebody you need to stop eating junk food, you can't have the ice cream, can't have the chips, can't have the hot dogs, that's not necessarily fun news to either hear or act on. Right. But when I tell somebody that giving your brain 7 to 9 hours of sleep opportunity tonight is going to improve your mood, your decision-making, and will decrease your preference for unhealthy foods the next day, not only is that benefit interesting, but having a good night of sleep feels good. It, to some people, feels like a luxury. And I totally appreciate, having gone through medical training, that there are times in life that may not be possible to get that solid 7 to 9 hours each night. But in the order of things that we should prioritize for our health, I think sleep needs to be at the top of the list. There's research that we talked about in Brainwash showing that in as little as one night of sleep deprivation, you can see changes in those parts of the brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, in the way that they process information, in that the amygdala seems to be more reactive to emotionally charged data. And I think, you don't need the research to prove this. I know how I feel if I've missed out on a night of sleep. You put me behind the wheel of a car, it's going to be hard to maintain focus. So we know that sleep deprivation changes our brain function for the worse. It's hard to remember things. It's hard to stay on task. And it goes so much deeper than that. When you see what happens with sleep, researchers are revealing that it helps to stabilize our brain networks. So certainly it's necessary for memory consolidation, but it also increasingly is being tied to our decision-making, in that we make better choices when we get a good night of sleep. And some of the research that was really compelling around this is that when you look at how people choose foods after either getting a good night of sleep or not getting a good night of sleep, people who are sleep deprived tend to choose more pleasurable foods that are more junk foods as opposed to healthier foods. People who are sleep deprived will eat more food, more calories than those who get a good night's sleep. And they won't burn them off. That's really important. It's one thing if you're eating more and then you're moving more, but when you're sleep deprived, you're not motivated to go out and exercise. So just giving yourself that 7 to 9 hour opportunity for good sleep on a given night, I think is one of the most powerful ways to support your brain health. And it's something that I feel people will enjoy.
Well, with that, well, first of all, the amygdala, right? I think of that as our fear or anxiety center. I don't know why. I just kind of correlate with that. So that I would say anxiety is a huge problem among many Americans. So by not getting sleep, we're actually intensifying that area of our brain. Is that right?
Well, I think there's something to what you're saying here, which is there's kind of a bidirectional interaction between sleep and stress, and there's certainly a powerful interaction between stress and anxiety. And anxiety, as far as brain activation, seems to be related to high levels of amygdala activation. What does seem to be the case is if a person is stressed, they're going to have trouble getting to sleep. And what does seem to be the case is if a person doesn't get good sleep, they will have changes in activation in molecules like cortisol, stress hormones. So I think it's certainly the case that we can get into a cycle where we're stressed, don't sleep, and then we're stressed because we didn't sleep. And I guess there are a number of ways you can kind of define stress on the brain, but not sleeping is in and of itself a stress on the brain because it's not able to do its standard kind of reset and resting processes. I guess I should rephrase that. The brain is super active during sleep, but it requires us to be kind of knocked out so that it can do what it needs to do to clean things out and reset things for the next day. So I think that, if you're going to look at what is it that kind of contributes to people not getting good sleep, it does seem like sympathetic or stress activation is a major contributor to that. Very basic, but you can imagine if you're stressed and you're laying in bed, your brain is not trying to go to sleep. It's trying to solve that problem. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense to me. So if you're worried about a cave bear that's been going through the camp, you're not just going to go to bed and your brain's not going to say, oh, I'll just go to sleep and deal with that tomorrow. It wants to solve the problem. But what we have today are problems that can't be solved, especially not in the course of, the hour that you're laying in bed. It's, I don't know, prices are getting too high, or my relationships are having problems, or people on social media aren't being kind to me, or you're worried about the latest environmental disaster or the war going on. And again, these are very different from the stressors that would have affected our ancestors. And so those programs play out in our brains and kind of just on repeat, and they activate the parts of the brain that then build up their strength to make it harder the next night, even more hard or harder the next night. So all that's a little bit of like the kind of concerning, worrisome stuff. What is great is that I'm not trying to say there are solutions to completely offset stress, but there are solutions that can help to mitigate it and get people to experience better sleep. And some of these very straightforward solutions would be, first of all, don't have your phone in the bedroom. And maybe people don't want to hear this, but I don't think the TV in the bedroom is a good plan either. And the reason for that is the media that comes through our screens is very activating. So if you're on social media, you're probably doing some, and I don't mean you, Kimberly, I mean just people. Right. People are doing some social comparison. People are getting engaged with it. That's what it's designed for. If you're watching TV, especially if you're watching the news, highly recommend you don't watch the news before bed. That is content designed to speak to the amygdala, to speak to your more primitive brain and get you concerned, get you stressed, get you upset. And the reason for that is because then you focus. When you are stressed, you focus more and you care more about what's happening around you. So highly recommend trying to limit access to stressful media or activating media before bed. And the other piece of this is the blue light that comes off our screens tells our brains, hey, it's still daylight out. Don't produce melatonin. Don't get sleepy because there's work to be done. There's things to be done. So first and foremost, removing screens from the bedroom as much as you can. And then some of the other interesting things are research shows it might be beneficial to lower the temperature of your bedroom before bed. This isn't necessarily a stress thing, but it seems like when the brain is told that the temperature is lower, or when the temperature is lower, that the body and the brain kind of settle into their nocturnal sleep promoting routine. From an evolutionary perspective, again, we used to sleep outside. As crazy as that sounds, we used to not be in these climate controlled environments. So the temperature kind of cooling for the night was a signal to our brains and our bodies that, hey, it's time to settle into sleep. We may have to do that a little artificially now, but dropping your AC or maybe opening a window so that the temperature is in the 60s may actually be beneficial for sleep. Mm. And there's one other one that I'll just bring up, which is trying to make the room on the whole a sleep sanctuary. Is a term you might have heard before. But the goal here is to set up the room so that your brain associates it with relaxation, so that you're not bringing your work into the bedroom. I already mentioned the phones, computer screens, TV screens, but just generally speaking, as much as you can. And I know it's challenging, let's say if you live in a 1-bedroom or a studio, but trying to set up at least the bed as a place that your brain associates with sleep and not with doing work. Because that way, when you get into the bed, your conditioning is, okay, now it is time to wind into going to sleep. So again, I'm not trying to say these are solutions to take away stress, but they are maybe solutions to help mitigate it and to create other patterns that tell your brain and your body, sleep is now the priority, and we're going to do that next rather than spin the wheels.
2 things. Does sleep increase our neuroplasticity and our BDNF? And what about, I've read in the book, you gave staggering statistics on people that use sleep aids. And I think there's like 400,000 deaths per year in the US linked to using sleep aids. Could you just briefly talk about the first thing, and then just if we can't sleep, is melatonin okay? Or what sleep aids? Because a lot of people, and then they get worried about not being able to sleep. It's this whole cycle. So what do you recommend?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I guess there's 2 parts of this. So sleep is, remind me the first question again.
There's an increased BDNF and neuroplasticity.
Right. So what seems to be the case is that sleep helps to regulate large-scale neural networks, which is a really complicated way of saying that sleep probably helps to regulate neuroplasticity through a number of different ways. So one is it appears to help integrate all of our neural circuits, keep things kind of in check. I haven't seen as strong of evidence that sleep is an upregulator of BDNF like exercise, for example. Okay. So I'm not sure if that is the mechanism, but it does seem like, for a number of reasons. I mean, one is it clears out the metabolic waste from the day, may have positive effects on our immune system. So we talked about how inflammation appears to block healthy neuroplasticity. So a number of reasons why I think sleep prioritization is great for brain health. Certainly it has an effect on neuroplasticity. It seems to have a positive effect, but it's not quite as clear as what you might see with exercise. And then to the second point, so if you look at cost benefit analysis for sleep aids, prescription sleep aids, it's pretty crappy in that they don't seem to promote healthy sleep and that they have a ton of side effects. And if you read Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, he goes into this in great detail. But it doesn't mean that these drugs can't or shouldn't be used. I think that looking at them as a long-term solution for sleep issues is concerning. On the other hand, if you look at, let's say you really want to do something to improve quality of sleep, the evidence for interventions outside, so conventional or conventional and sleep drugs, so things like Ambien, they work to make people pass out, but it's not necessarily that good quality of sleep. Similarly, some people use alcohol and they pass out. Doesn't mean you're getting good sleep. And one just little correlate to this, some people will drink caffeine late in the day at dinner and they'll say, oh, I fell asleep and I did great. Sleep quality isn't necessarily good. So you really have to be thinking about more than just I was unconscious as it relates to that. So it's the same thing for sleep drugs as it is for people who think they can have that midnight espresso and still get a good night of sleep. There's been a lot of data around melatonin for a number of different reasons. And melatonin does appear to kind of get people to sleep quicker. So it makes people fall asleep quicker. The long-term data or the large set data for melatonin as a kind of nightly sleep aid, I haven't seen be very convincing. I think the indications for melatonin are really for people who are trying to reset their kind of circadian rhythm. There may be an additional indication for elderly people as they may not produce as much, but the amount of melatonin that you're getting in a capsule is hundreds of times higher than what is naturally produced by the body. And there was an analysis that showed that the variability in what's actually in those capsules is extreme. So you might be getting 10, 100 times more than what's listed, or you might be getting 10 times less. So there's a number of reasons to be, I guess, a little bit concerned about melatonin as kind of a standardized supplement. I've taken melatonin. I do take it on occasion, especially when I'm in an environment where I need a little extra like reset. But I think there is something that just still concerns me a bit as it relates to, this is a hormone that is naturally produced by the body in much smaller quantities than what we're taking. So we are kind of overriding all of our body systems with really high levels of it. And there's some research that people have been talking about recently as it relates to melatonin as a sex hormone suppressor. And it isn't as clear the effects of this on adults, but melatonin does suppress sex hormone production in youth to some extent. And so I'm not trying to say that as a reason not to take it, but it is something that I'm actively monitoring, because I think we've kind of fallen into this idea that melatonin is safe because it's natural, but it's being taken in levels that are way, way higher than what you would naturally find. And from what I know about our way our body works is that there's a reason things are set the way they are. And trying to override that, whether it's through a natural molecule like melatonin or through a drug that acts on a certain receptor at a much, much stronger level, is always worth being cautious of. I don't think there's any downside to things like chamomile, valerian, and stuff. It's just that the research doesn't show that they're as potent. But what I do think is important there, and I enjoy herbal tea, is that it's not just about the molecules from the plant that are making you sleepy. It's about having a wind down routine. I think that's really important. If you're making yourself a cup of tea as a way of getting ready for bed, you are telling your body in a number of different ways, this is part of the process, right? We are taking the 5-10 minutes to make this tea, maybe another 10 minutes to enjoy the tea. Maybe you have the tea while you're sitting in the tub or doing a little bit of meditation. I think that is really important. And so I think that is something that everyone can benefit from. It doesn't necessarily have to be one of the teas I recommended, but just some sort of a wind down routine that is telling your brain and body, hey, we're getting ready for bed. So to kind of recap here. One, I'm concerned about sleep aids. I've taken them in the past. I used to have insomnia when I was in high school. So I've tried Ambien, Lunesta, a bunch of other brands. They're powerful and they will knock you out. I'm concerned about those being long-term safe solutions for people. And I'm concerned that when people start on drugs of any sort to mask something that can otherwise be kind of further investigated, which is, why do you have insomnia? You don't have an Ambien deficiency. There's something going on in your life that is causing you to be having a hard time falling asleep. I'm concerned about that. So that's the kind of conventional sleep aids. Melatonin, I do take sometimes. I think we're still not exactly sure as to the safety profile. And I also think, just like with conventional sleep drugs, if you're needing melatonin every night to fall asleep, there's probably something additional that you should look into as to why you're having trouble going to sleep. And then the herbals, I think by and large, teas and things are great. Anything that can be part of a sleep kind of wind down routine. I do think people should be careful with herbal supplements. That's a different world. And so there are a lot of those out as well. Those are not standardized in any way, shape, or form. So I'm not saying I'm universally concerned about people taking herbals for bed, but make sure the brand that you're choosing is a reputable one. There have been people that I've seen in the hospital who have had toxicity from taking an herbal supplement that turned out to be super high levels or contaminated or whatever else. So just make sure, if that's something you choose, a sleep dietary supplement, that it's one that comes from a reputable brand.
Wow, that's crazy. I thought real quick, a couple little things I wanted to cover with you is, well, you talk a lot about being stuck and getting unstuck. And I wanted to know, in the book, you guys did a great job. You talk a lot about social media use and even the effects structurally on the brain with internet addiction and that. Why do you feel like we're so stuck? And what do you think the effects of all of this are on us as far as maybe depression or just our brain health in general?
Those are big questions. Why we're so stuck is kind of the central question that I've been focusing on for my personal life and in my research for the last few years. And so that brings in what happens in the brain and depression, that brings in decision making. It's my belief that as a reflection of our modern environments, that various aspects of our biology are becoming stuck, rigid, locked into unhealthy patterns, whether that's our metabolic health, our diets, or our brain function and the wiring of our neurons. Things are kind of being locked into these unhealthy patterns. And so as a reflection of this, we are experiencing higher rates of chronic diseases, both mental health issues and kind of physical health issues, as well as degenerative brain diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Mm. And I think a number of the reasons why we're becoming more stuck are the things that we've been talking about already in this. Mm. But central to it all is, or I guess, two ideas. One is, I think we are fish swimming in a polluted river. And so we are surrounded by a toxic environment that polarizes our bodies and our brains towards a state of stuckness. And the other thing is the prevailing mentality of the modern day is instant gratification. Mm. And that is a problem because all of the things that we reach to get that instant gratification have been purposely set up and have been very clearly made unhealthy. So whether that's reaching for your phone to scroll on social media, reaching for junk food, reaching for reality TV, they're all just kind of filler rather than the real thing. Mm-hmm. And the net result of this is that we are feeling worse. And in an effort to not feel as bad, we are trying to find the instant gratification solutions that are the same things that are making us feel bad. And so that kind of speaks to the social media piece. I'm on social media. I think it can be an amazing tool, mm-hmm. but I think it is shark infested waters and you're trying to swim a long distance. You might have a nice swim, but there are a lot of sharks. And if you're not watching where you're going, you will not have a good day. So we came up with this tool called the test of time for the book, and which I think is still very relevant as far as a way of approaching social media and digital time.
Really good.
So T is time restricted. We talked about this as it relates to food, mm-hmm. but I think it's the same thing for our social and just generally for our digital media. And that is to say, I'm going to allow myself to have 20 minutes, let's say 30 minutes, the duration of the latest episode of whatever show you're watching. Mm-hmm. And you stick to that. So you set a timer, right? You say, I will dedicate 30 minutes to a show or to going on social media, Instagram, whatever. Mm-hmm. And you allow that timer to go off. And when it goes off, you have to then make a conscious decision to either continue or to stop. And so that leads then to I, and I is for intentional, which is having a plan for our interactions with this digital media. If you don't make a plan, it will take advantage of you. And I don't think there's much debate about that. It is designed to capture and steal your attention and your information, right? This is how targeted ads work. They are benefiting from this more than you in most cases. So being intentional about it means having a plan. Do you want to go and see what's going on with your business page? Great. Do you want to go and check in on your niece and see how her baby pictures look? Great. Do you want to watch that TV show with your partner that you've really been enjoying? Great. That's very different from kind of scrolling, incessantly without a plan. It's very different from binge watching a TV show that you never thought you would enjoy and actually don't enjoy. So I, again, is for intentional. And then M is for mindful. One of the things that's been very clear is that the way people engage with modern media tends to be mindless. Mm. And I will say, and Kimberly, I don't want to assume for you, but there have been times where I will all of a sudden realize that I have been on social watching TV and just kind of missed the last 20 minutes or whatever, as far as it flew by. Right. it was 1 p.m. and I was going to watch a show and now it's 3 p.m. Or it was 5 at night and I was just going to check on a friend on social media and now it's 5:30. We don't know where that time has gone. So being mindful necessitates that we are aware of kind of where that time is going and also how it is affecting us. Meaning, if you start to feel stressed when you're watching the news, if you start to feel stressed when you're on social media, be aware of that and let that guide your use. And then E finally is for enriching. And this, in a nutshell, means that you need to benefit more from your digital media consumption than digital media benefits from you using it. Because in the background, it is taking your information and it's taking your time. So if you can pause after you finish your digital interaction and say, that was a net benefit to me, then the E in the criteria here is fulfilled. And if it isn't, then you go back and you look at your T, you look at your I, you look at your M, or is it time restricted? Is it intentional? Is it mindful? And then hopefully the next time around, you can get to the enriching part and the answer will be yes.
I love that. And I love how, like, in a nutshell, looking at your social media, you say in the book, how is it making me feel? Is this adding meaning to my life? Did this make me feel better by viewing this? Or is it, subtracting or taking away, making me feel worse, just like you're talking about? And if we can just have that overall thought in our mind, how is this making me feel? And just say, I feel depressed. I feel like I'm not pretty anymore. Or I'm not this, or I don't have this. Then just shut it off and move on, because it's totally affecting our brain and our well-being. I found that tool really helpful. And I found it interesting more in the book, and definitely people just need to read it. You talk about how 40% of college students are less empathetic, and you talk about the benefits of empathy. I thought that was really fascinating, because you do see that in society, people as a whole are less empathetic to others. And I found the benefits of empathy in general so surprising, just in relation to our health and all these things we've been talking about, just like eating right and sleeping. I mean, the benefit of having empathy for others is along those similar lines for disease prevention and all that. I found that really fascinating. I just want to talk about one little topic that you seem like really super excited about, and it has to do with psychedelics. I've never talked about it before. I don't know much about it, but I've been listening to you, and now I'm really interested in it. And I just wonder, what have you learned about psychedelics, and what is this being used for? Because it sounds way out there. Is this something that we may look to in the future, or they may already be using it for depression or anxiety or some of these things?
Yeah. And obviously this is a very big topic, so we probably won't do it much justice here, but big picture ideas. Depression affects upward of 300 million people in the world. Based on recent estimates during the pandemic, that number has gone up by over 50 million as a result of the pandemic. And as I said before, our conventional antidepressant medications still leave about a third of people not experiencing significant benefit. So all of that kind of comes together to make one point, which is we desperately need new and better solutions for depression. And psychedelics have gained traction for a number of reasons. But one of those, and probably the most important of those, is that these molecules, which include LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, that these molecules may have a significant effect on mood. And so there are kind of a number of different ways in which these molecules are being looked at right now, predominantly, almost exclusively in a research setting. It's not like these are being used in clinics, unless you count ketamine as a psychedelic. But I mean, let's just talk about last year. Last year, there were 3 studies that were published in 3 of the top tier medical journals that looked at the effect of psychedelics on mental health. And so it was looking at MDMA for PTSD, showing a significant benefit. It was looking at psilocybin in kind of 2 trials for depression, both showing a benefit. And one of those, I should say, was comparing psilocybin to escitalopram, which is an SSRI. And it showed that they were more or less equivalent. So the person who was treated with, or the people treated with the SSRI versus the people who were only treated with the psychedelic psilocybin had roughly equivalent levels of improvement. So the study said, there was no difference. So it didn't seem to be better. But what I take from that is there was no difference. That's amazing, because this molecule in this study was equivalent to standard of care. So again, there are lots of potential indications for psychedelics. There's a range of what psychedelic molecules are. Some people will consider ketamine a psychedelic. Some people don't consider MDMA a psychedelic. But the kind of heart of it is these are molecules that are many of them naturally occurring. Some of them have been kind of synthesized now, but the originals naturally occurring that have been used by humans probably for around 10,000 years. There's some data from 8,500 BCE for human use that have been used by humans in rituals, ceremonies, rites of passage for thousands of years, and that are only recently being rediscovered or being emphasized because mental health is so bad and we need new solutions. And because I think people are looking for ways to change their mind, to just pull straight from Michael Pollan's title of his book. This is in many ways the anti-stuckness as it relates to what it does for our brains and our perspective. Psychedelics open up our willingness to see the world in a new way. They increase trait open-mindedness. They allow people to see things from a different perspective. And just as one example, I had the opportunity to interview Anthony Bossis recently, and he is an NYU PhD who published some of the first some of the most potent work linking psilocybin, which is a psychedelic found in magic mushrooms, to end-of-life existential distress. They took people who had kind of terminal diagnoses, cancer and the like, and they dosed them with psilocybin. And they found that this single intervention was significant to dramatically improve quality of life for people, their mental health, and that those results lasted for years in these people. And so these are smaller studies, and this is a narrow slice of the population. But the idea that a naturally occurring molecule at a one-time dose is capable of inducing those changes in perspective for that duration of time is really powerful.
Wow.
And depending on when people listen to this, legalities may have changed, but right now, federally, psychedelics are illegal. They're Schedule 1. So psychedelics and heroin are in the same bucket, meaning that the government says there's no good use for these molecules. But on a state by state and even county by county, city by city basis, there's been efforts to decriminalize the use of and possession of psychedelic molecules. And recently, Oregon passed legislation which, first of all, reduced penalties, decriminalized the possession of these molecules, but second of all, created an opening for development of a protocol so that mental health practitioners could use psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, in their clinics for people with mental health outside of clinical studies. Right now in the United States, if you want access to psilocybin, you either have to do something illegal or you have to get access to a clinical study. But due to, in part, the safety profile that's been shown, which has been really good when these molecules are used in these studies, kind of the right set and setting, and the fact that a couple of these molecules, namely psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD, have been given breakthrough status by the FDA for further investigation, there is a hope that people who need them will have access to these molecules outside of these limited clinical studies in the very near future. And I am excited about the possibility of additional solutions for mental health, because what we have now is nowhere near enough. And the idea that a molecule or a pill or whatever you want to call it is capable of improving mental health after a one-time dose that does not require a person to stay on a prescription for months, years, potentially the rest of their lives is super exciting.
Wow. Wow, that is true. I thought of ketamine when we used to use that in the emergency room as a sedation for procedures, especially for the young kids. So it's wild to think that that's a psychedelic. I was going to ask you, I'm glad you went into the prescription status and that, because I was going to ask you, what level they're at and who prescribes them. So thanks for covering that. Lastly, I want to talk with you just real quick on, well, I want to know the power of nature and connecting with nature, what we've lost, and lastly, just how that benefits our health, our mood, all the way around. We don't think of it as this simple little thing that can be so powerful in our life.
Yeah. But I think this is the perfect kind of topic to wrap this up with, because in addition to sleep, the other thing that I tend to recommend most to people is vitamin N. It's nature exposure. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is I'm always a fan of the free interventions and the readily accessible interventions. I think there's a huge difference between telling somebody you need to eat all organic, locally raised foods that are going to cost an arm and a leg and are hard for people to access, versus saying, if you can get outside, if you can even find a couple of trees, a little green space, that is an intervention for your physical and mental health. And research here has really exploded in the last few decades, driven first and foremost by what they've done in Japan, where they have kind of committed to exploring how nature influences health. The field there is called Shinrin-yoku, or it's basically forest bathing. And the basic idea is just by being in nature, you get benefits. No agenda. You don't have to necessarily do anything. You just have to be around natural environments. And what the research most consistently shows is that nature exposure appears to lower markers of stress. So both subjective stress and things like cortisol in the saliva. I like one study that came out of Michigan recently, where they showed that when you take people and put them into a natural urban environment, real key here, they're not sending them to a national park. They're just telling them, find a little green space in your local town. That 20 minutes was enough to lower people's levels of cortisol in their saliva. There's also really fascinating work showing that when people look at pictures of nature compared to looking at pictures of urban environments, that they tend to make more future-oriented decisions. They tend to be more balanced, more reflective as it relates to thinking about the future. There's research showing that nature exposure appears to increase empathy. Interestingly enough, to go back to the last conversation, psilocybin and psychedelic use appears to increase empathy for nature. So there's kind of a bidirectionality there, where exposure to certain aspects of nature increase interest in nature, and nature appears to increase interest in other people. So with all of this kind of combined, I just think it is one of the cheapest things that a person can do to get a little bit of nature in their day. And I get it. I mean, we're recording this, it's April, it's still really cold where I am. You may not want to go outside, or you may not have a ton of trees where you live. Indoor plants, I think, are a great option. There's evidence for what are called phytoncides, which are basically these molecules produced by plants that when we take them in have effects on our physiology. So just being around plants in any context, I think, is a good plan. Those phytoncides are certainly something you can kind of get from some essential oils, but I think that the best scenario is to be around the actual trees and things that produce them. So I just think if you can, and I would argue you can, try to give yourself a little bit of nature in your week. And that can be as simple as trying to get outside for 20 minutes. It can be as simple as getting an indoor plant. Snake plants are really easy to care for. Succulents are really easy to care for. I know, as somebody who doesn't do great with plants, those are kind of my go-tos. And there's even some data for like virtual nature backgrounds and stuff, but I would say try to stick to the real thing as much as you can to get started. And I think for mental health, for stress especially, this is a very cheap intervention that all of us should be taking advantage of.
You are so right. And you go through extensive in the book. It's great. And I wanted to tell you, I'm a nurse practitioner full-time, actually, in the urgent care center. I had 4 different people yesterday dealing with stress, anxiety, wanting EKGs. And, it's high right now. And so I recommended prescription nature yesterday to those patients. And I said, even if you can just get out 15, 20 minutes after you eat, preferably, would be great after lunch. And, it's just that they were just like, wow, I didn't even think about that. And I was talking about some of the benefits that you shared. And I think that, I think you're right. I think that can, honestly, if you could do one thing to benefit your health, it's go for a walk in nature.
Mm-hmm.
So what's next
Very
for
true.
you? Where can people find you? What are you working on now? And where can we find out more about you and all this things that you're sharing?
Yeah. Geographically, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, which I guess is as specific as I'll get for where people can find me. Right now, I'm doing a couple of things. One is further research on mental health and on psychedelics. And so I've been presenting on that recently and have a couple of upcoming presentations on that subject, specifically psychedelics, neuroplasticity, and depression. Hoping to maybe work on another publication in this for peer review in the coming months. My kind of day-to-day work these days is focused more on the immune system. And so the group I work with, we're actually running a pilot study right now, testing the effects of plant nutrients on markers of epigenetic function, which relate to the immune system. And it's kind of a complicated thing, but that's ongoing. So we're actually recruiting, and there's people in that study right now. It's an interventional trial. And then we're also working on building out programs for practitioners to help educate them on immune health and to bring to bear a lot of the recent science that has been published on how the immune system is kind of a portal to better health, understanding pathways of immune aging and how we may be able to target those using certain nutritional strategies. Fasting is a good example of that, but also exercise and certain plant nutrients called polyphenols. But for people who are just looking to more generally connect with me, my website, austinperlmutter.com, is a good place to go. I've been trying to be more consistent with my newsletter, and then social media. It's just Austin Perlmutter on Instagram. You can find me, and I post videos and other content there.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. And I would love to have you back to talk about epigenetics and the immune system. I'm super interested in that. So if you're willing, I'd love to have you back sometime a little further down the road. You've done that research.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, great meeting you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.